Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West. It's time to keep Series 13 and Week 97 going with another Tolkien Tuesday. Last week, we began our look at letter number 228, written to Alan and Unwin in January of 1961. The context for this was the Swedish publisher of The Lord of the Rings expressing their concern that the appendices would make the book pedantic. But then we left letter number 228 to go back a few years to letter 204, where the Swedish translator, Olmarks, had sent him a list of names that he was changing, but Tolkien was a bit confused. I mean, why send me this list if you're not inviting my opinion and input? But if you are asking for my opinion and input, well, the timing is awful. First, Olmarks says, "We are going to start the composition now." Well, so much for my input. And Tolkien points out that the list comes at a very busy academic time of year. Tolkien rightfully gripes to his publisher, "I've had to sit up far into the night even to survey the list." Conceding the legitimacy or necessity of translation, which I do not, except in a limited degree, the translation does not seem to me to exhibit much skill and contains a fair number of positive errors. Tolkien puts the errors in a footnote without helping us with the Swedish. Thankfully, the book adds that for us. Let's take a look at those errors then. Ford of Bruinen was translated as Bjornevad, meaning bear ford, clearly stemming from the translator reading Bruin in Bruinen as meaning bear. I mean, it is the Dutch word for brown that is an English term for brown bear, like the UCLA Bruins. My high school mascot was a Bruin, even. That's a silly mistake for the translator to make. Olmarks also translated the name of the town of Archet. The Chet in English means wood or forest, so Archet likely means near the forest or by the forest. He translated Archet as Gammelby, a word that just means old village. Tolkien wonders if this might be, quote, a mere guess, I suppose, from archaic, seeing as how archaic and Archet are similarly spelled. Anyway, the letter goes on, or the footnote goes on. The mountains of Lune, Ered Luin, were translated as Moenbergen, which means moon mountains, clearly thinking Lune like lunar, of or related to the moon. Now, that thankfully didn't make it in the final translation, but the River Lune and the Gulf of Lune did end up as Moenfloden and Moengolfen, Moon River and Moon Gulf. Finally, the Gladden Fields, where Tolkien used the Old English word gladna as the flag, the yellow iris that grew in the marshes, was translated as a Swedish phrase for bright plains. From glad, maybe? I honestly don't know what this guy was thinking. And Tolkien says, look, I get it. This is difficult material, so maybe these errors are excusable. But he rightly points out they are regrettable, and they could have been avoided by earlier consultation. Tolkien continues, "It seems to me fairly evident that Dr. O has stumbled along dealing with things as he came to them, without much care for the future or coordination, and that he has not read the appendices at all, in which he would have found many answers." Now, the rest of that letter, 204, features Tolkien's hopes that he would be consulted by translators early in the process going forward, along with an acknowledgement that the lack of an index of names is a serious handicap. Wondering if that's something Unwin might be able to help with. But for now, let's go back to letter 228, where we began all this last week, where Tolkien points out another egregious mistake by the Swedish translator. Dr. Olmarks, for instance, though he is reported to me to be clever and ingenious, can produce such things as this. In translating a line from the prologue, "They seldom wore shoes, since their feet had tough, leathery soles, and were clad in a thick, curling hair, much like the hair of their heads," he read the text as, "Their feet had thick, feathery soles, and they were clad in a thick, curling hair," and so produces in his introduction a picture of hobbits whose outdoor garb was of matted hair, while under their feet they had solid, feather-cushioned treads. This is made doubly absurd since it occurs in a passage where he is suggesting the hobbits are modeled on the inhabitants of the idyllic suburb of Headington. Now, I confess I'm going to need one of you folks in the UK to help me with this. I don't get the Headington reference. It feels a little snarky, tongue-in-cheek, sarcastic. I'm not sure. All I know about Headington is that it is a suburb of Oxford, and all I know about it is the Headington shark, which is clearly not the point since that didn't exist until the 80s. But seriously, Dr. Olmarks, feathery souls? Clothes made of hair? Just no. Please ask if you're not sure, okay? Come on. After this, it appears that Tolkien was asked about the publisher including some brief biographical information about Tolkien in the translation, and that Tolkien had gotten to see some of it at least. Tolkien's first response is, "I do not object to biographical notice if it is desirable." The Dutch did without it. "But it should be correct, and it should be pertinent. I think I must ask to be allowed to see anything of this kind in future before it is printed." But what Tolkien has had a chance to skim here must have been interesting. His final paragraph, which I will read in its entirety, minces no words. "Who is not a safe source in the hands of foreigners ignorant of England. From it, Olmarks has woven a ridiculous fantasy. Olmarks is a very vain man, as I discovered in our correspondence, preferring his own fancy to facts, and very ready to pretend to knowledge which he does not possess. He does not hesitate to attribute to me sentiments and beliefs which I repudiate. Among them, a dislike of the University of Leeds because it was northern and no older than the Victorian 70s. This is impertinent and entirely untrue. If it should come to the knowledge of Leeds, fortunately unlikely, I should make him apologize." Well, hold on to your hats, folks, because letter 229, which we'll start next week, is all about the biographical notice. And oh boy, you thought he was hard on Dr. Olmarks here? Just you wait. Now, before we go, I want to give you a quick follow-up to our coverage of letter 222A, way back in week 93. That's the one where Tolkien mentioned that the Silmarillion might now be described accurately as in an active state of preparation, thanks largely to my present secretary. At the time, I couldn't figure out who that secretary was. Was it A.M. Hope, who it had been earlier that year? There was a letter from her to Rainer Unwin, but it was dated more than a year before letter 222A, so that's no guarantee. And while we knew that Joy Hill would become Tolkien's secretary later in the 60s, this was very early in the year 1960, and there was no clue, at the time for me at least, as to who that secretary was. Well, tip of the hat to John McHenry, who sent me an email shortly after that episode released. He pointed me to an entry for July 5th, 1959 in Skull and Hammond's Chronology, where we read about a letter that Tolkien had written to someone in which he mentions having found a possible successor to Miss Hope. So it's not Miss Hope. Skull and Hammond say that it is, quote, possibly Elizabeth Lumsden, who is certainly his secretary in June 1960. Now, the Chronology is one of those works that hasn't been converted to an ebook format, or at least not an iBook, so I don't have it. That makes finding little details like this quite a bit more laborious, so thank you, John McHenry. For now, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week when we look at a letter that Tolkien sent to Allen and Unwin in which he enclosed a copy of Olmark's nonsense in the hope that you may think it justifies my annoyance. Get out your popcorn, folks. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join my content council, get an ad-free feed and a bonus episode every week. And then join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. Subscribe to the show in your podcast apps or to the channel here on YouTube, where the full back catalog has now been uploaded for you to enjoy. And be sure you're following @PrancingPonyPod on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.